Asterisk, before we begin, I'd like you to get comfortable. Wherever you are, let your body settle as if the bed beneath you were gently molding to your shape. There's nothing more you need to do tonight. No more tasks, no more noise, no more thoughts pulling at the corners of your mind. Just let it all drift away. Feel your chest rise and fall like a lazy desert breeze curling along the edge of a canyon, warm, wide, unhurried. Let your breathing slow as you settle into stillness. Picture a horizon stretching for miles flat and gold, and painted with the last amber light of day. Let that peaceful image fill you right to the edges of your thoughts. The wind is soft here, slow and steady, and it carries the faint scent of dry sagebrush, old wood, and something sweet, like sun-warmed saddle leather mixed with creosote. You're in the West now, but not the one you've seen in movies, not the one shaped by smoke and gunpowder. This is a different West one, without bullets, without pistols, without the weight of cold steel in a holster. Our story today begins in a small town called Willow Run, a place so tucked away in the folds of desert canyons that the sun takes its time arriving each morning. Willow Run had no jailhouse, no gallows, and no blacksmith making revolvers. Instead, it had wide front porches, a deeply respected code of quiet honor, and a sheriff who wore no badge, just a long duster coat, a smooth lasso at his hip, and a look in his eyes that said more than any bullet ever could. His name was Eli Rembrandt, and in this town they called him the Whispering Sheriff. He never shouted, never cursed, and never raised a hand unless it was to tip his hat or twirl his lasso. Justice in Willow Run wasn't decided by shootouts or saloon brawls. It came softly, slowly, like dust settling on the windowsill. Duels, when they happened, were fought with walking sticks, words, or whips, tools that hurt pride more than flesh. And when tempers flared, it was usually over poker hands, stolen poetry, or the brewing of a secret batch of moonberry cider, which, though beloved, was banned during certain moon cycles due to its strange, dizzying effects. There was a peace in the town that no one dared disturb. That peace wasn't born out of fear, but out of something older, mutual respect, and something even rarer, trust. The people of Willow Run didn't always get along, but they always showed up. Every Friday night, just as the sun slipped behind the canyon rim, they gathered in the town square, not for announcements, but for the duels. Only these weren't bloody confrontations. These were contests of poetry, of storytelling, of clever insults delivered with grace. Some folks brought walking sticks carved from driftwood, polished to a sheen, just in case a duel called for a tap-to-tap spar. Others came with fans, parasols, or feathers tools for the more dramatic art of non-violent fencing. That's how conflict was handled here, through craft, not cruelty. And on the rare occasions that words failed, there was always the lasso, the sheriff's silent symbol of control. Eli didn't need a gun. He needed only to step forward, slow as honey dripping from a spoon, and the town grew still. That's the world you're drifting into now, a land where silence is more powerful than thunder, and calm is king. Let the dust of Willow Run settle around you like a blanket. Let your breath fall in rhythm with the slow clomp of a mule's hooves along a dusty trail. And rest, the story's only just beginning. The days in Willow Run stretched long and golden, unhurried like the sun itself was sipping sweet tea on its way across the sky. In the morning, the grocer's bell chimed soft, as a wind chime. And Miss Lila Thorne, who ran the flower stall, arranged her wild roses in old jelly jars, humming tunes that only the bees seemed to recognize. Children drew chalk patterns on the boardwalk, weaving bright spirals between boot prints and wagon tracks, and old-timers leaned in rocking chairs, whispering over checkerboards. There were no gunshots, no cracking echo bouncing between buildings. Only the occasional whinny of a horse, the rustle of wind-blown curtains, and the delicate clink of tea cups on saucers. Sheriff Eli made his rounds slow and quiet, boots tapping a steady rhythm on the wood. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. People said the man once stopped a brawl just by clearing his throat. He had a gift, some said a way of pouring calm into a room like oil into a lamp. When trouble came, and it sometimes did, because folks are folks, he'd offer the offending party a duel. Not the kind you'd expect. No bullets, no brass, just a challenge. You bring your best story, he'd say in that slow, low drawl, and I'll bring mine. Let the town decide. Sometimes it was poems. Sometimes it was a riddle-off. Once it was a whittling contest under the old cottonwood tree, where two rivals carved hummingbirds from pine knots as the cicadas sang. Nobody wanted blood. Nobody wanted pain. They wanted resolution, something final, but gentle like the last note of a lullaby. There were, of course, wanderers, travelers from far-off places where gunpowder still reigned. They'd roll into town with steel on their hips and suspicion in their eyes, expecting to find the usual tension, the usual edge. But Willow Run had a way of smoothing even the sharpest corners. One such traveler was a man called Dyer Flint, tall as a tree and twice as silent, with a revolver that hung heavy and untouched. He rode in just after a dust storm, his horse weary, his boots caked with mud from a place no one asked about. He dismounted slow, scanning the saloon, the smithy, the old church with its bell, rusted to silence. And then he saw Eli leaning by the post office, sipping coffee from a tin mug, calm as a stone in a stream. Town seems quiet, Dyer said. It is, Eli replied. Unnaturally quiet, Dyer pressed. Eli sipped his coffee again, then said, Quiet's natural if you let it be. And that was that. Dyer Flint stayed. Weeks passed, and the revolver on his hip gathered dust, unused, unneeded. He learned how to carve spoons. He helped plant a windbreak of junipers. And in time he began to smile, not often, not much, but enough. At night, under oil lamps and starlight, folks would gather around the fire circle, telling stories instead of starting fights. The fire crackled. The wind murmured through the dry grass. And above them all, the sky held a peace that felt deeper than anything words could touch. Just let yourself drift there now. Let your body sink lower, as if the soft hum of that faraway town is calling you gently home. That summer the wind never blew too hard, and the nights always cooled just enough for the porch swings to creak slow and steady, like a lullaby in wood and rope. The townsfolk said it was the season of balance, when the air held the memory of spring and the promise of fall, and everything in between moved in rhythm. And in this harmony something special happened. Stories began to ripple through the town like gentle waves in a still pond. They weren't shouted or performed. They were passed along in low tones, around tables and fences, on the backs of grocery lists and the edges of laundry lines. Tales of kindness, of change, of how words once stopped a thief from robbing the church, not through threat, but through a poem. The thief, they said, had crept in late one night, ready to steal a silver cross, only to find a handwritten note resting on the altar. A short verse, penned by the schoolteacher, Miss Evelyn. You came here for silver, but found instead grace. Take nothing. Leave lighter. Walk on, leave no trace. No one saw him again after that, but the next day the silver was still there, and beside it a dried flower pressed between 2 pages of a hymnal. These were the kind of legends Willow Run inspired. They weren't loud. They didn't demand. They lingered in the bones. And on one particularly star-strewn night, Sheriff Eli stood by the watering trough as a hush settled over the whole town. A trial was to be held the next morning, an uncommon thing, since disputes rarely grew large enough to need one. A dispute between brothers Amos and Callan Rye over a lost inheritance and a broken promise. The town had watched them grow up, fight, mend, fight again. But this time it had gone deeper. Words had been thrown like knives. Silence had followed. And now both men had agreed to one final duel, not with fists or flames, but through letters. Each man would read a letter aloud, written to the other, revealing their side, their wounds, and what they'd lost. The town square was quiet that morning. People stood without whispering, faces soft with worry. The sun hadn't quite broken over the ridges yet, and the sky was brushed with pale lavender and faded peach. Amos stepped up first, his paper shaking in his hands, and began to read. His voice was rough, unpolished, but honest. He spoke of promises never made, of feeling unseen, of trying to live up to a shadow. Then Callan read his voice barely above a whisper. He spoke of fear, of missing their mother, of how he'd once tried to write a song about Amos, but could never finish the last line. When it was over, neither man moved for a long time. Then Amos stepped forward, held out his hand, and Callan took it. No judge, no verdict, just words, and that was enough. That night the square was lit with candles, not because of the trial, but because someone had found an old fiddle in the general store attic, and music wanted to be played. So they danced, slow, barefoot, laughter low and easy, like warm syrup across a biscuit. In the distance, coyotes yipped once or twice, as if offering their own applause. Let that feeling wrap around you now, soft and slow. The glow of lanterns, the scuff of boots and dust, the scent of cedarwood smoke curling through twilight air. Let it rock you gently toward rest. The days in Willow Run stretched long and golden, unhurried, like the sun itself was sipping sweet tea on its way across the sky. In the morning the grocer's bell chimed soft as a wind chime, and Miss Lila Thorne, who ran the flower stall, arranged her wild roses in old jelly jars, humming tunes that only the bees seemed to recognize. Children drew chalk patterns on the boardwalk, weaving bright spirals between boot prints and wagon tracks, and old-timers leaned in rocking chairs, whispering over checkerboards. There were no gunshots, no cracking echo bouncing between buildings. Only the occasional whinny of a horse, the rustle of wind-blown curtains, and the delicate clink of tea cups on saucers. Sheriff Eli made his rounds slow and quiet, boots tapping a steady rhythm on the wood. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. People said the man once stopped a brawl just by clearing his throat. He had a gift, some said a way of pouring calm into a room like oil into a lamp. When trouble came, and it sometimes did, because folks are folks, he'd offer the offending party A duel, not the kind you'd expect. No bullets, no brass, just a challenge. You bring your best story, he'd say in that slow, low drawl, and I'll bring mine. Let the town decide. Sometimes it was poems. Sometimes it was a riddle-off. Once it was a whittling contest under the old cottonwood tree, where two rivals carved hummingbirds from pine knots as the cicadas sang. Nobody wanted blood. Nobody wanted pain. They wanted resolution, something final, but gentle like the last note of a lullaby. There were, of course, wanderers, travelers from far-off places where gunpowder still reigned. They'd roll into town with steel on their hips and suspicion in their eyes, expecting to find the usual tension, the usual edge. But Willow Run had a way of smoothing even the sharpest corners. One such traveler was a man called Dyer Flint, tall as a tree and twice as silent, with a revolver that hung heavy and untouched. He rode in just after a dust storm, his horse weary, his boots caked with mud from a place no one asked about. He dismounted slow, scanning the saloon, the smithy, the old church with its bell, rusted to silence. And then he saw Eli leaning by the post office, sipping coffee from a tin mug, calm as a stone in a stream. "Town seems quiet," Dyer said. "It is," Eli replied. "Unnaturally quiet," Dyer pressed. Eli sipped his coffee again, then said, "Quiet's natural if you let it be." And that was that. Dyer Flint stayed. Weeks passed, and the revolver on his hip gathered dust, unused, unneeded. He learned how to carve spoons. He helped plant a windbreak of junipers. And in time he began to smile, not often, not much, but enough. At night, under oil lamps and starlight, folks would gather around the fire circle, telling stories instead of starting fights. The fire crackled. The wind murmured through the dry grass. And above them all, the sky held a peace that felt deeper than anything words could touch. Just let yourself drift there now. Let your body sink lower, as if the soft hum of that faraway town is calling you gently home. The sun rose a little slower that week, or maybe it just seemed that way. Each morning golden light crept carefully over the ridgeline, spilling onto the rooftops of Willow Run like a slow pour of warm honey. The townsfolk noticed it, too, how the light felt softer, how the air smelled sweeter, how the mornings stretched like old cats in the sun. Finch Delacroix's presence hadn't changed the town. Not exactly. It had simply tuned it to a different key, like plucking a single string and finding the whole melody richer because of it. People began to walk more slowly, not because they were tired, but because they wanted to listen to bird song, to the way wagon wheels whispered on dirt roads, to the sound of their own feet. There was something healing in the hush that had settled over Willow Run. Conversations drifted like smoke from morning cook fires, curling through the streets and lingering in the spaces between buildings. It became common to see neighbors sitting side by side without speaking, just watching the sky change colors, or tracing the movement of clouds like reading old familiar letters. One evening, a boy named Tomlin, barely 10 years old, always barefoot, and known for his love of sneaking sugar cubes from the general store, stood up during the listening circle. He held a paper, creased and wrinkled, and with trembling fingers he began to read a story he'd written. It was about a fox who could sew dreams into scarves. His voice cracked. He lost his place once, but when he was done there was a long, deep silence, not out of discomfort, but reverence. No one clapped. Instead, Finch nodded slowly, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small bell, which he rang once, very gently. That became the tradition from that night forward. When a story truly moved someone, they would ring the bell. Just once, soft and clean like glass striking glass. The bell's sound became a kind of blessing, a way of saying, "I heard you," without having to speak. And in a town where stillness was valued more than volume, it meant everything. Even Sheriff Eli, who was not much for ceremony, began to carry a small brass bell tucked in his coat pocket. He used it only once, weeks later, after a woman named Dahlia recited a letter she had written to her younger self. The whole town wept that night, not from sadness, but from the strange, quiet ache of being seen. As autumn rolled in, the days grew shorter, and the air turned crisp, carrying with it the scent of apples and hay. Willow Run prepared for the equinox gathering, an old tradition almost forgotten, revived now by a town rediscovering the beauty of things that didn't need to be useful to be meaningful. Lanterns were strung from every porch. Paper stars were folded by children and tied to fence posts, and the townsfolk brought blankets, stories, songs, and pies filled with squash and spice to the center square. That night, as twilight dipped the canyon in purple shadow, the fire was lit, not for warmth, but for glow. People sat close, shoulder to shoulder, heads on shoulders, hands linked under quilts. Finch played his dulcimer again, the notes clear and soothing as a lullaby hummed by the wind. And when the final ember dimmed to silver, Sheriff Eli stood slowly, cleared his throat, and spoke just 3 words, "Let it rest." And so they did. The sun rose a little slower that week, or maybe it just seemed that way. Each morning, golden light crept carefully over the ridgeline, spilling onto the rooftops of Willow Run like a slow pour of warm honey. The townsfolk noticed it, too, how the light felt softer, how the air smelled sweeter, how the mornings stretched like old cats in the sun. Finch Delacroix's presence hadn't changed the town. Not exactly. It had simply tuned it to a different key, like plucking a single string and finding the whole melody richer because of it. People began to walk more slowly, not because they were tired, but because they wanted to listen to birdsong, to the way wagon wheels whispered on dirt roads, to the sound of their own feet. There was something healing in the hush that had settled over Willow Run. Conversations drifted like smoke from morning cook fires, curling through the streets and lingering in the spaces between buildings. It became common to see neighbors sitting side by side without speaking, just watching the sky change colors or tracing the movement of clouds like reading old familiar letters. One evening, a boy named Tomlin, barely 10 years old, always barefoot, and known for his love of sneaking sugar cubes from the general store, stood up during the listening circle. He held a paper, creased and wrinkled, and with trembling fingers he began to read a story he'd written. It was about a fox who could sew dreams into scarves. His voice cracked. He lost his place once, but when he was done, there was a long, deep silence, not out of discomfort, but reverence. No one clapped. Instead, Finch nodded slowly, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small bell, which he rang once, very gently. That became the tradition from that night forward. When a story truly moved someone, they would ring the bell. Just once, soft and clean, like glass striking glass. The bell's sound became a kind of blessing, a way of saying, I heard you," without having to speak. And in a town where stillness was valued more than volume, it meant everything. Even Sheriff Eli, who was not much for ceremony, began to carry a small brass bell tucked in his coat pocket. He used it only once, weeks later, after a woman named Dahlia recited a letter she had written to her younger self. The whole town wept that night, not from sadness, but from the strange, quiet ache of being seen. As autumn rolled in, the days grew shorter, and the air turned crisp, carrying with it the scent of apples and hay. Willow Run prepared for the equinox gathering, an old tradition almost forgotten, revived now by a town rediscovering the beauty of things that didn't need to be useful to be meaningful. Lanterns were strung from every porch. Paper stars were folded by children and tied to fence posts. And the townsfolk brought blankets, stories, songs, and pies filled with squash and spice to the center square. That night, as twilight dipped the canyon in purple shadow, the fire was lit. Not for warmth, but for glow. People sat close, shoulder to shoulder, heads on shoulders, hands linked under quilts. Finch played his dulcimer again, the notes clear and soothing as a lullaby hummed by the wind. And when the final ember dimmed to silver, Sheriff Eli stood slowly, cleared his throat, and spoke just 3 words. Let it rest. And so they did. As autumn deepened and the days shortened, Willow Run turned inward like a nesting bird. The winds grew cooler, rustling dried corn stalks and whistling through the eaves of homes patched with quilted drapes and bundles of dried lavender. Mornings now began with the crackle of hearth fires being stirred and the creak of shutters opening to meet the first silver blush of frost. Evenings came early, painted in pale amber light, and by twilight the town glowed like a lantern itself, soft, warm, and full of quiet life. Children chased each other through leaf piles, bundled in shawls far too large for their little frames. Elders wrapped up in rocking chairs told stories they only half remembered, their voices becoming softer with each retelling. And still, through it all, Finch played. Not always for an audience. Sometimes just for the wind, or the stars, or for himself. His dulcimer songs came to sound like part of the land-gentle notes rolling out over the hills, like echoes of something ancient, something that had always lived in the soil, but needed someone with the right heart to wake it. Sheriff Eli continued his rounds, though now they were slower, more contemplative. He walked not to enforce, but to accompany, to let the town know he was still there, still steady. He stopped more often to listen, to watch the way the shadows moved as lanterns were lit, to share quiet glances with neighbors wrapped in scarves. Willow Run didn't speak in noise. It spoke in gestures, in pie left on porches, in letters slipped under doors, in old boots repaired and left near woodpiles for those in need. Then one evening, as a soft snow began to fall, thin flakes drifting like feathers from a sleeping sky, a new sound joined the town's rhythm. A bell. Not the dulcimer bell of story circles, but a handbell rung 3 times outside the town's meeting hall. That meant a council was being called, not because of danger, but because of dreams. Inside the hall, warmed by a tall brick hearth and the scent of cedar wood, a group of townsfolk gathered. Finch sat in the corner, his dulcimer across his knees, his fingers idly plucking soft, curious notes. Eli stood near the hearth, warming his hands. It was the school teacher, Miss Evelyn, who finally rose to speak. Her voice was calm, her words measured like brush strokes. "We've built something here," she said, looking from face to face, not just with our hands, but with our choices, with stillness, with story. And now others are noticing. She paused, unfolded a letter she'd received from a friend in another town, one filled with curiosity, questions, even hope. They want to know if peace without weapons is possible, if a town can truly thrive without force. Eli nodded, slowly. They want to see how we've done it. And so it was decided, not with cheers, not with declarations, but with a gentle murmur of agreement, that Willow Run would open its doors quietly and intentionally. That winter, as the frost grew thick on the window panes and the lanterns glowed with greater purpose, visitors began to arrive. Not many, just a few at a time. They came from places where shouts echoed through alleys and fear sat heavy in the corners of rooms. Here they were met with soft greetings, warm stew, and quiet nights under heavy quilts. The visitors didn't arrive in grand caravans or formal processions. They came quietly, one or two at a time, following the long, narrow trails that led to Willow Run, like threads weaving through the folds of a well-worn quilt. Some came out of curiosity. Others came chasing rumors. A few arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hollow look of people who had heard too much shouting and seen too many sparks in the dark. They didn't all stay, but the ones who did seemed to soften by the day-like apples left near the hearth, slowly warming through. The townsfolk welcomed them gently, offering small kindnesses without demand. A bowl of stew, a spare coat, a chair pulled close to the fire. Questions weren't asked unless invited. Names weren't demanded, only offered in time. It was a place where people could arrive as questions and slowly, gently remember their answers. In the evenings, the dulcimer rang out its usual soft tones, joined now and then by other instruments. An old fiddle found in the church basement, a set of bells from a traveling tinker, even a flute carved by a boy named Rowan, who used to speak only in whispers, but now played music as if it were breath. With each new arrival, the town grew, not in size, but in tone, in texture. Some visitors brought stories, others brought silence. Both were welcome. And more than once, when someone shared a piece of themselves during the nightly story circles, a bell would ring clear, respectful, and kind. It was never forced, never expected, but always understood. Sheriff Eli kept walking the town, boots crunching over frost-crusted ground, coat flapping gently in the wind. He didn't speak more than usual, but something about his silence seemed fuller now, like a book that had finally found its last chapter. He no longer needed to be the keeper of peace. He was simply part of it. The town had taken his quiet philosophy and made it their own. Then one morning, a young woman named Clara arrived at the edge of town, leading a donkey and carrying a weathered case strapped to her back. Her coat was worn, and her eyes held stories too large to fit into words. She didn't speak when she arrived, only nodded and looked up at the sky, as if trying to remember how to breathe in silence. It was Miss Evelyn who greeted her, gently taking the donkey's reins and saying only, "You're just in time for the thaw." Clara stayed at the boarding house, sleeping in a room with lace curtains and a patchwork quilt that smelled of dried mint and thyme. She didn't speak for days, but she listened, sat by the fire, helped peel potatoes, walked through town with her hands in her coat pockets, nodding to dogs and children and birds on rooftops. She attended the listening circle one evening, sat near the back, and watched with still eyes as a man recited a letter to his future self. When the bell rang at the end, she flinched, but didn't leave. It wasn't until the first true melt of spring that Clara spoke. She unstrapped her case, opened it slowly, and revealed a strange, beautiful instrument no one had seen before, half harp, half lyre, with silver strings that glimmered in the light like morning frost. She sat beside Finch and began to play, not loudly, not perfectly, but with feeling, and the sound she made was like water running over smooth stones, like snow melting into the river, like grief learning to sing. From that moment on, Clara became part of the town's unspoken rhythm, as much a part of Willow Run as the dust-colored hills or the worn wooden porches that lined the square. Her music wove itself into the town's tapestry, like golden thread hidden in a patchwork blanket, subtle but irreplaceable. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her words carried the weight of long roads and longer silences. She said once, to no one in particular, "It's not that I was lost before. I just didn't know there were places made of quiet." And the way she said it made even the wind pause to listen. Spring bloomed gently across the prairie. Wildflowers pushed up through the thawed earth like little bursts of memory, and the creek that bordered the west end of town gurgled with laughter again. People began working their gardens, repairing fences, oiling creaky hinges on barn doors. There was no rush, no hurry, just the easy knowledge that everything in its time would return to life. The listening circles moved outdoors, and with the arrival of warmer evenings, new stories bloomed alongside the crocuses. Tales of past lives, of former regrets, of second chances, of letting go. One evening, a boy named Jasper stood to share something. He had come to town with his aunt weeks earlier and had hardly spoken since. But that night, beneath the lantern tree, he held up a wooden box and opened it to reveal a tiny mechanical bird, its wings made of scrap tin, its eyes button bright. He twisted a gear on its side, and the bird sang. Not a song exactly, but a melody. High, tinkling notes that sounded like laughter remembered from childhood. The crowd didn't move. When the melody faded, Finch rang the bell. Then Clara added a single note on her lyre harp, and a hush fell deeper than silence. That was the night the townsfolk realized something had changed, not just in themselves, but in what Willow Run had become. It was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming a teacher, a way of remembering a slower truth in a world that often ran too fast, spoke too loud, reached too quickly for force. More letters arrived, asking questions, requesting visits. And every time one did, Sheriff Eli would unfold it slowly, read it by lamplight, then pass it around at the next circle. The townspeople would consider, reflect, and reply not with decisions, but with stories. They sent poems instead of rules, riddles instead of decrees, and each letter ended with the same phrase, "Let your next steps be soft." And so, as the seasons continued their slow turn, Willow Run remained unchanged in the most remarkable of ways. It didn't grow taller, or louder, or grander. It grew deeper, like roots reaching into rich soil, like a lullaby learning new verses. The stories continued, the bells rang softly, and the wind still carried music through the grass. By the time the first summer storm rolled in slow, warm, and full of thunder that sounded more like distant drumming than anything, frightening Willow Run had fully embraced its identity as a sanctuary not only of peace but of presence. The rain came gently at first, darkening the dirt roads and soaking the wild sagebrush until the scent of the town became earthy and sweet. Children danced barefoot in puddles as adults leaned against door frames, sipping warm drinks and watching the clouds swell with a kind of reverent wonder. Finch often said the rain here had its own kind of song, not just in its rhythm against rooftops or the soft hiss on windows, but in the way it seemed to draw people inward, not into themselves, but toward each other. The community hall, which once sat quiet for months at a time, now became a warm center on rainy nights. Blankets were spread across the floor, candles flickered in mason jars, and music echoed gently beneath the wooden beams like the heart of a sleeping beast. On one such night, Clara brought out a small woven pouch she had carried since her arrival. She opened it with delicate hands and revealed a handful of sea glass pale greens, soft blues, and one sliver of translucent amber. She passed them around the circle, inviting each person to hold one and say what it reminded them of. One said the green reminded them of their mother's garden. Another said the blue was like the eyes of a friend they'd never said goodbye to. The amber shard reminded Eli of the golden hour just before dusk, when the air smelled like dust and hope. It was the kind of evening that didn't ask anything of you except that you feel it deeply. With every story told, the storm outside softened, as though it were listening too. As summer unfolded in gentle waves of heat and blossom, Willow Run began sending out invitations, not announcements, not advertisements, just handwritten notes signed only with, "We are still here. Come softly." People continued to arrive. An artist from a distant city who had forgotten how to paint. A couple who had once led a choir but hadn't sung in years. A farmer who brought seeds from her homeland and, with the help of neighbors, planted a garden shaped like a spiral. There was no ceremony, no claim of leadership. Willow Run offered only space, quiet, and time, things the world often forgot to give. And so the town continued, shaped not by the decisions of a few, but by the steady kindness of many. The story circles remained. The bells rang. New traditions formed, like the feast of forgotten recipes, where each family brought a dish their ancestors used to make. The air filled with the scent of cinnamon porridge, lentil pies, cactus preserves, and teas made from herbs gathered at the edges of the prairie. And always someone played, sometimes Finch, sometimes Clara, sometimes Jasper with his mechanical bird. The melodies didn't compete. They wove together like voices in a long, slow hymn, each one making room for the next. The days after the blue moon felt softer somehow, as if the town had exhaled something it didn't know it was holding. Everything carried a hush, not silent, but aware, like the way one walks through a room where someone is dreaming. The prairie winds were slow and fragrant, full of crushed wild sage, and the faint sweetness of ripened pears hanging heavy on the town's single orchard tree. Mornings began not with urgency, but with a series of gentle awakenings, the sound of shutters being opened, kettles warming on stoves, and birds calling to one another in sleepy, melodic bursts. Willow Run had always prized slowness, but now that slowness felt like its own kind of ritual, a way of showing love to the day ahead. At the bakery, Mr. Alcott, began leaving loaves out on the windowsill for anyone passing through, bread dusted with rose petals, thyme, or dried blueberries. Beside each one he placed a note. Take what you need. Share what you can. Some days the loaves would vanish quickly. Other days they would stay until evening, when the scent of warmth finally drew someone close enough to remember what they'd forgotten they needed. Sheriff Eli stopped wearing his coat. The weather was warm, but that wasn't the reason. He'd simply found that he no longer needed to carry the weight of authority with him. His presence was enough. People didn't look to him for rules. They looked to him for reminders. On one warm evening, he stood beneath the lantern tree and spoke quietly to a small group of new arrivals. This town doesn't run on laws, he said, looking up through the branches. It runs on stories, and the story we're telling here doesn't need a loud ending, just a good middle. Finch had begun writing again, not just music, but letters, essays, and even poetry. He kept most of it tucked away in a leather-bound journal, but now and then he'd slip a page into the town's communal message board, a wooden wall behind the general store where people posted drawings, thoughts, or kind reminders. One day he penned a poem that read, "No one asked the wind to sing, and still it did, and still it does. No one carved the canyon's path, but every stone remembers us." The paper stayed there for weeks. Some read it and smiled. Others copied it onto scraps and tucked them into coat pockets or pressed them between pages of books they weren't finished reading. That was how things worked in Willow Run. Nothing was forced, and nothing faded. It simply became part of the place, and slowly, gently, word of the town continued to spread, not as a legend, but as a whisper. A friend would tell a friend. A letter would mention a quiet place beyond the hills, where time moved more like a river than a train. People began to arrive with no expectations, just hope. They came tired, afraid, quiet. Some stayed only a night. Others stayed longer. Each one left something behind. A story, a song, a woven square of cloth. A piece of themselves stitched into the slow, steady rhythm of the town. By the time the maple leaves began to shift into amber and copper, Willow Run had taken on a quiet glow that came not from the sun or the lanterns, but from within. The town had become something more than a place, something more than its buildings, its dust roads, or the stretch of sky that seemed to lean in closer every evening. It had become a feeling, a memory being made even as it was lived. You could feel it in the way people smiled a little longer after locking eyes, in the way conversations paused, not out of awkwardness, but to let the silence breathe between sentences. Clara's music had become softer, simpler. She no longer needed to fill the air with complexity, just a few notes here and there, at just the right moment, like punctuation in the wind. Her students had learned this too. The children who once rushed to play now sat with their instruments in their laps, waiting, listening, letting the space tell them when it was time to join in. Some songs were only one note long, some no notes at all. That, Clara said, was the lesson. Sometimes music was simply the choice not to interrupt the beauty already happening. The townspeople began another new ritual, a circle of memory. Once a month, near the full moon, they would gather in the grassy field just beyond the stables, where the wind moved a little more freely and the crickets hummed like a soft drum. Each person would bring one object, a stone, a piece of thread, a feather, a dried leaf, and place it in the center of the circle. And when they did, they would speak its story. Just a few words, a name, a moment, a goodbye. Then the object would be added to a long cloth banner Lena had been weaving since midsummer. She called it the Long Memory, and it stretched now from one wall of the community hall to the other, rippling gently whenever the door opened. Sheriff Eli placed a coin into the circle one night. No one had seen him carry it. It was simple, dulled by time, the markings nearly worn smooth. He turned it once and his fingers looked at it like it might whisper back to him, and then said, "This bought me a meal in a town that forgot how to listen." I left the next morning, didn't speak for 6 days. Then he placed it down and walked back to his seat, nodding once to Finch, who answered with a note so soft it felt like breath. Not all visitors understood Willow Run right away. Some arrived with loud stories, quick hands, or the restless eyes of people used to being on guard. But Willow Run had no interest in taming anyone. It simply offered space, and space, in its own quiet way, reshapes the sharpest things. Some left within a day. Others lingered at the edge of town, watching, waiting for something unnamed to loosen within them. One visitor, a woman named Rhea, arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a long silence. She stayed at the boarding house, wandered the fields at sunrise, and eventually began cleaning the old chapel, sweeping its stone floor with slow, reverent strokes. She never spoke of why she came, but one morning she left a single line carved into the chapel's doorframe. Some prayers are just the sound of someone staying. And from then on, people began visiting the chapel again, not to kneel or to confess, but simply to sit, to be still. As autumn faded into the early hush of winter, Willow Run settled even deeper into its rhythm of quiet wonder. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of pine and chimney smoke, and the nights began to stretch a little longer, like the land itself was tucking in beneath a thick wool blanket. Frost kissed the windows in delicate lacework, and the fields lay still under a thin veil of silver. The world around the town seemed to breathe slower, as though taking a cue from the people who lived within it. Inside homes, quilts were pulled from cedar chests and draped across chairs and beds. Warm mugs were passed from hand to hand, and small fires burned low and steady in stone hearths. The community continued to gather, not for anything urgent or grand, but simply because the togetherness felt good. Music still echoed through the town, though now it came more often in whispers, soft humming while mending clothes, gentle tapping on a tin bowl, the occasional sigh of wind through the strings of Clara's lyre left resting by the window. It was during this time that Finch announced without fanfare that he would be leaving in the spring. "Not because I want to," he said during a quiet circle, "but because there are people out there who don't yet know that places like this can exist. I want to carry the story." No one tried to stop him. That was the Willow Run way. Instead, Lena wove him a satchel lined with blue thread. Clara composed him a walking tune, and Eli handed him a small bell with no explanation at all. Finch spent the winter preparing, not packing so much as writing, sketching, remembering. He wandered the town with a quiet smile, tracing the familiar with his fingers fence posts, door frames, the cool stone of the well. He was collecting it all the way a river collects sunlight. Stories travel best when they're full of warmth, he told Clara one snowy morning. She didn't answer, just handed him a jar of honey and nodded. By midwinter, the snow had begun to stick. Not heavy or burdensome, but soft and steady, covering the rooftops and hills in a gentle hush. The whole town felt like a held breath. Even the animals seemed quieter, more thoughtful. Children walked in single lines through the snow, making patterns just for the sake of seeing them. And adults, wrapped in shawls and scarves, sat near windows or strolled in pairs, speaking only when words felt like the right shape for the moment. The story circles didn't stop. They simply moved indoors, lit by candles and the soft orange of firelight. The long memory banner now reached across the entire east wall of the gathering hall, its patches and threads a tapestry of time, of grief turned into color, of joy stitched into something permanent. Each new visitor was offered a strip of cloth and a needle, though not everyone accepted it right away. Some needed time, some needed silence, and some, like Rhea, needed to give before they could take. But eventually most left their mark, even if all they offered was a single knot or stitch. And always, through every story told, every pause held, and every note played, there was Sheriff Eli, still walking his same path, still pausing by the post office, still tipping his hat to the sky as if thanking it for holding off the wind just a little longer. He had grown older, yes, but in Willow Run, age didn't press down. It simply folded itself into a person like a well-worn page. He no longer needed to be a protector. It was a reminder, a living echo of why this place worked, because no one rushed, no one shouted, and when something broke, they didn't panic. They gathered. They mended. Spring arrived quietly, as it always did in Willow Run, not with fanfare or sudden bloom, but with a gradual lifting of the frost, a softening of the soil, and the return of birdsong to the branches just outside bedroom windows. The town stirred a little earlier each morning. Doors opened to let in cool air. Footsteps became lighter. The scent of fresh earth rose with the mist at dawn, and in that first morning light, everything seemed possible again. Finch's departure drew near, though no one spoke of it as a loss. It was a passing, like a lantern handed off to the next traveler. There was no farewell planned, no grand event. That wasn't Willow Run's way. On his last morning, Finch sat beneath the lantern tree, his dulcimer resting in his lap, though he didn't play. Around him the town moved slowly, children with their slates and satchels, elders gathering in pairs for their daily walk, the clink of spoons and teacups. Sheriff Eli approached and stood beside him, silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out the old letter from the territorial office, the one that had once asked if Willow Run would reconsider its laws, and gently handed it to Finch. "Take this with you," he said, not as a warning, as a reminder of what didn't happen and why. Finch smiled, folded the letter, and tucked it into his satchel. He rose, slung the bag over one shoulder, and turned to look at the long memory banner, now complete, fluttering slightly in the spring breeze. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He had lived it. As he walked out of town, he passed Rhea by the chapel, Clara by the schoolhouse, and Lena at her loom. Each nodded. No words were exchanged. None were needed. At the edge of the ridge, where the path bent down into the next valley, Finch turned one last time. The town shimmered below, like a memory already forming. He rang the small bell Eli had given him once, clear and soft, and then disappeared over the hill. Back in Willow Run, life went on. The story circles continued. New visitors arrived, shy and tired, and were met with tea and silence. The dulcimer was played again by Clara now, and by the children who had learned to hear the space between the notes. I kept walking his quiet path, now slower, but steady, and the bell by the lantern tree remained unpolished, but well loved, always ready to ring once for the stories that truly mattered. In the evenings the town still gathered, not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. They sat beneath stars that never hurried, on quilts stitched with patience, and listened to music that knew how to wait. There were no guns, no blood, no need for walls, just quiet, just care, just a choice over and over again to let peace be the loudest sound. And somewhere beyond the ridge, on a quiet trail under a sky full of stars, a traveler walked carrying with him a single story of a town where conflict became poetry, and stillness was more powerful than any weapon.